About 3 months ago, I started updating Delfino Square, making it look a little more like something you'd find in Mario Kart 8 and adding some of my own details. It was an awesome journey, and if you haven't seen it yet, I've got a full video with all of the episodes included to catch up before the modding. And almost 2 months later, it was done. Or at least done enough. And it was time to move on to some spooky stuff for October. But now that it's November, I'd like to come back to Delfino Square and do it justice. I want this track playable in Mario Kart 8. Even if it's super glitchy at first, I just want it to be technically running in-game. So, here's the plan. Step 1. Simplify the model. Step 2. Clean up folders and files. Step 3. Get the model into Track Studio. And Step 4, get the game to load the track without crashing. Now it's worth noting that I'll be doing this in Mario Kart 8 for the Wii U, not Deluxe. Apparently it's easier to switch it to Deluxe from Wii U rather than the other way around, so we'll start there. The first step is to simplify. I basically want to get rid of all of the fancy Blender stuff that won't translate to Track Studio. I started by joining trees together to remove them. I'm planning on having most of these replaced in Track Studio with trees that'll actually have animations. I'm not sure how I'll make those trees look like these ones, but I know that having completely static trees is gonna look a bit off. Then I set up the drawbridge. I'm sure there's technically a way to animate this in Track Studio, but that is way above my skill level. So my plan for now is just to fix the drawbridge at a ramp-like angle. I've also got to get rid of any Blender lights. So I sifted through this horribly unorganized hierarchy and got rid of all of those. I also stumbled upon some old assets in there that were hidden in case I needed them later, so I deleted those too. On top of deleting old useless stuff, I also need to be joining similar objects to simplify this model as much as possible. Even after it's simplified, it's still going to be pretty far from something that Track Studio will accept, but I need to simplify it for my own sake when it comes to the next part. There we go, now we've got it all joined into one object. Now comes the real fun part. Depending on your definition of fun. Now that everything is on one object, I can go down the list and begin to clean these textures and organize the texture folder. This is step 2. There's a good amount of textures in here that I thought I was going to use but didn't, or did use and then changed, or used but never moved to this folder. So now I've got to go down the list of 100 some textures and make sure they all link to a texture in the same folder. A little ways into this process, I noticed that the little shop covers were still black and white. So I selected a couple sets of them, recolored the texture a few different ways in Photoshop, and got those new materials set up here. I also noticed that the vegetables were looking a little blurry, so I used the super zoom neural filter in Photoshop to enhance them a bit. Enhancing vegetables is not generally part of this process, but sometimes you gotta take risks. And as if I was avoiding something, I ended up finding another little issue to fix. These flag banners that stretch across the street aren't really connected to anything, so I hooked the ends up to some balconies. Yeah, there we go. And you know, there isn't really a finish line yet, so I snipped the finish line out of a texture from the original Delfino Square, which worked pretty well. Well, now that I've run out of delays, I guess I should continue organizing these textures. I really wanted to emphasize the naming this time. I've done this modding process a couple of times before, and I know that having your texture images named the same thing as your Blender materials is going to make things way easier later on. One thing that I thought went really well during this process was this flower texture. Well, actually, I had like 3 flower textures, which is an issue when 2 of them share the same flowers, because that's kind of a waste of a texture. So I selected the less important flower texture, RIP, and assigned that geometry to another one. And due to them having a similar format, most of these flowers just mapped on perfectly. Then all I had to do was select the ones that didn't and put them on the red flowers. Another thing I've got to do here is make sure that I don't have any materials that rely on Blender doing any of the work. This water material, for example, is just using Blender's material system to color it, so I don't really have anything to export. So I just painted a blue square in Photoshop and exported it. I'm not 100% certain that this is the right way to do this, but I'm gonna give it a try. Well, now that things are fine-tuned and organized, we can start the even more tedious part. See, Track Studio wants this model to be divided by material. That means one mesh and only one mesh for each material, and each mesh should only have its one material assigned to it. Which means that for the shop covers 2 material, for example, I select the geometry that it uses, separate it, name it, remove all other materials on that object, and then remove shop covers 2 from the main model that I separated from. This is one of those tedious processes that stays relaxing as long as you don't start thinking about how much you need to do after this. or the fact that if something goes wrong, you might need to redo it all. But if you just have some faith and focus, this can be pretty fun. It's that relaxing yet stimulating kind of tedium that I sort of look forward to in projects like these. Well, here we are, every material separated into its own object. Now I can move on to step 3 and hopefully get this model into Track Studio without it yeah, no, it doesn't work. In case you haven't modded any video games before, this is what it looks like. Hours and hours of feeling your way in the dark only to meet a sort of anticipated disappointment. You know it won't work, and it somehow still hurts when it doesn't. But knowing that things get better, I pushed on in search of an answer. I headed over to Squadaloo's tutorial playlist on YouTube, where I first learned how to do Mario Kart 8 modding. I'll have that playlist linked in case any of you guys want to learn. It's a really great guide that I'll certainly be coming back to when I need it. So the first thing I noticed was that in the description of part 1, he specifically mentions that you need to use Blender 3.0 or under. So I went over to Blender's website and downloaded 2.79. Upon opening this ancient software, I met with nostalgic UI and the nonsense of left click moving the cursor around while right click left clicks, which is something that left click would usually do in any other software. So the first thing I did was fix that in the preferences. Then I tried opening the .blend file, which understandably crashed the software, since it's trying to open a new fancy schmancy high-tech Blender 4.2 project. It probably couldn't process the fact that Blender now uses the left mouse button to select things by default. So I looked into how I could open a new Blender project in an old version of Blender. And basically, a project from 4.2 won't open in anything older than 3.0. So I downloaded Blender 3.0 and got that open. This looks a lot more like modern Blender, and luckily it does indeed open the project. You know what still doesn't open the project though? Track Studio. So being on the wrong version of Blender wasn't the issue. Or, much more likely, and much more terrifying, it was the issue. An issue. One variable of a multi-layered problem. A stack of errors that I somehow need to thread the needle through without really knowing what they are. I looked back at Squadaloo's tutorial for anything that might offer some guidance, and I found that he did have a few export settings that I hadn't tried yet, but nope, that wasn't it either. But just like before, I need to keep those export settings, because they could still be causing issues alongside something else. Okay, I need to make sure that it's not Track Studio, or something intrinsic to Blender that's causing the issue, so I exported a cube and tried loading that. And it did load, which is good news. But also kind of bad news. That means it is something in my model that's causing issues, not the export settings or anything extraneous like that. So I looked around my model in search of irregularities, and I found that each object had a bunch of vertex groups assigned to them. So one by one I deleted all of those. But that didn't work either, so I figured I'd make sure it wasn't just a straight up polygon count issue. I deleted large portions of the model and kept trying to load what was left. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have been deleting them, but luckily I didn't accidentally save and then close the software and kinda ruin everything. And eventually I had whittled it all the way down to 500 triangles, and it still wouldn't load. Literally just the vegetables. But this is really useful. It means there's some kind of data in the vegetables that's probably in all of the other objects that's causing issues. And lo and behold, I found it. There's a list of vertex colors that I cleared out, and the vegetables loaded. Now, this is a far cry from my planned revamp of this track. In fact, I don't know that you could call this a revamp or a track since it's now just low poly vegetables, but it's a start. So now I've got a lead. Get rid of all of the vertex colors on every single object one at a time. After about 2 objects, I looked up if there was any way to get rid of all of them on all objects. I tried using some scripts that I found, but they had errors and scared me and made my head hurt, so I looked for an easy peasy add-on that would do it for me. Luckily, I found just the thing. It's something called Game Asset Creation Toolset, which you can just download inside of Blender on newer versions. So I did that in 4.2, cleared the vertex colors, and brought it back into 3.0. Now I can export it and see if it works. Guess what it didn't do? Well, crap. Now I'm back to the vegetable strat. So I reduced it down to just a few objects and tried that, which did work. That's kind of good. It means that I either have an issue that's present only on some materials or meshes that aren't included in this small sample, or that there's an issue with the overall polygon count. So I started by seeing how many objects I could get away with importing, and things worked fine up to about 16,000 triangles worth of Delfino Square. But I kinda want all 100,000 triangles, and Mario Kart 8 can absolutely handle 100,000 triangles, and so can Track Studio. So there's something else going on here. But at this point, I was almost out of options. I noticed that a lot of materials were set to alpha blend instead of opaque, but that didn't fix it either. So with no real leads to go on, I searched around forum posts for anything to try. And I found something. A forum post on Game Banana of someone having issues opening my Coconut Mall model in Track Studio. Figures. At this point, I didn't know if I should be proud to run into someone working on one of my models, or to feel bad for putting out these cursed models that have no chance of opening in Track Studio. But in the replies, I found an answer that I figured was worth trying. The comment mentions exporting the model as a DAE. I've been using FBX since that's what worked for Squadaloo, but it wouldn't hurt to try exporting it as a DAE. Oh my vegetables, it works. Now there's much to be done beyond this point, but to be at this point is pretty amazing. So the first thing I want to do before getting textures set up is tackle the collision model. What we have right now in Track Studio is just a visual model. We need a basic version of this that the game uses for collisions, otherwise we'll just fall through the floor. So I duplicated everything and joined it into a new object. This is going to be the collision model. I can now go around safely deleting anything that the player has no business colliding with. Basically, anything beyond the track boundaries can go, like trees, benches, buildings, walls, etc. Some walls and buildings will stay though, if they act as track boundaries. Now that we have our basic collision version of this track, we need to think a little bit about how we want this collision model to act. If a part of the track should act like a concrete wall, then it should share a material with anything else that should act the same way. This won't look good, but this model isn't going to render anyways. I'm just setting materials that I can give properties in the engine. I don't need to use the concrete texture to represent concrete, but using textures whose names describe their function will make setting up those properties easier. Well, now that we have this, we can export it and get back into Track Studio. We'll get that collision map in soon, but first I want to import the textures here and get them set up. To do this, I right-click on Textures, select Import, and select all of the textures that I want to bring in. Then I've got to go down the list one by one and make sure that the textures fit their format. So regular diffuse textures use BC1 sRGB, normal maps use BC1 UNorm, and specular maps use BC4 UNorm. Unless they have color, then they use BC3. Well, this looks pretty close to our Blender model, except for a few areas where stuff's kinda invisible, like these buildings. Checking in on the Blender model, it turns out the normals have been kinda screwed up for a while now. These red faces are back faces, which will be invisible since rendering a face that's supposed to be on the inside of an object is pointless and wasteful. So it looks like I've got some normal map flipping to do. This is the kind of tedious process that isn't fun. 1,000 little fragments strewn about the model that I've got to tend to in detail. And this could have been avoided if I was paying attention to normals back when I was duplicating these buildings over and over and over again in the first place. But oh well. Finally, all of the normals have been fixed, or at least the ones that I caught. Now we can re-import the model, and by this point I had changed a few textures and cleaned the folder up a bit more, so I re-imported those as well. This is better, but the alpha maps still don't seem to be working. So I went to these leaves here and looked around the settings for anything that might make these alpha maps work. And in the render state settings, I found exactly what I was looking for. So I switched it to alpha mask from opaque. I was also getting a bit frustrated at how fast the camera flies around, but I couldn't find anywhere to change that, so I'll just have to get used to it. I carried on switching transparent textures to alpha mask when I noticed that the trees don't look right. That's because they've got the wrong texture entirely, so I switched that out for the correct one. But this texture doesn't really have a proper alpha map, so I threw it into Photoshop and made the background transparent. But it looked a little empty now, so I added another layer of leaves to the texture. Well, now that we've got a model that seems relatively stable, I can get all of the normal maps applied. Because while it did automatically put the base diffuse textures on everything correctly, it didn't apply any of the normal maps. So I've got to do that to each material manually. And some of these textures are meant to mirror rather than just spill over, so I set those to mirror in the wrap mode section. Then I noticed that the dirt path was being buried underneath the grass for some reason, even though it wasn't doing that in Blender. But eventually, I figured out that it was because the grass was being triangulated in Track Studio, which messed with the shape of it quite a bit. So I just triangulated it in Blender and adjusted it from there and re-imported the model. And luckily all of my textures, including the normal maps, stayed properly applied to this new model, which is really nice. Well, I think now is a good time to import the collision model. Here you can see we get to set up how the materials will behave in game. So the wood material is going to be a wooden wall. Metal is a metal wall, cobble road is a stone road, grass is a grass road, and so on. Sometimes you need to get a little more creative, like mushrooms being a sponge wall. And that's the collision map. Now we'll head to the last version of this model that we need to set up over in the map editor. This is where you can set up game events and rules for your track and that kind of stuff. The first thing we need is the start. That way the game knows where to set you and other players or bots before a race. And I think we've got an issue. So that's why the sensitivity was so high. Turns out I've been making a Delfino Square revamp that only subatomic particles will enjoy. So I headed back into Blender and made the track 10 times bigger and replaced the model in Track Studio. But this is still too small, so I went up 50% from there, which still wasn't enough. So I brought it back to 10 and went double from there, so a total of 20 times larger than the original, which wasn't big enough. So I went to 40 times, which was too much, so I dialed it back to 30. Which I think is just right. Now we've got to re-import the 30x collision map and set up all of those materials again. There we go. And now for the final major step of getting this track technically working in-game. The lap paths. These are how you draw the boundaries and course of a lap on your track. You start at the finish line, set the first one to lap check 0, and alt-click to create points in the path. This needs to be a very careful process, because it's really easy to screw something up here. If your track crashes the game, there's a good chance it's because you messed up the lap paths in some way, or at least that's my experience. They don't need to be perfect, but you don't want them to be out of order or doing any weird glitchy stuff. You also want to make sure that the tunnel that's created from one point to the next encompasses the whole drivable area, because these dictate the boundaries of the track. So if you drive or fall out of this tunnel, Lakitu picks you up and puts you back in here. Creating the lap path can be a very fun process, since it really starts to feel like this is becoming an actual track, but it can also be very frustrating. If you use too few points in the path, you cut off corners of the track that will now be considered out of bounds. But if you use too many, you've got a real mess to deal with that could cause issues. But if you can slow down and find the balance, it's very enjoyable. Now the alleyways are something a bit different. I've got to create a branch in the path and then rejoin the two paths again, which isn't something I've had to deal with before. The guide for Track Studio says that this should work fine the way I'm doing it, but I have a feeling this is going to take some work later to get just right. And the section after the alleyway was even trickier. I struggled to find a way that made sense to split the shortcut on the dock. At first, I just opened the whole area to be the same path to keep things simple, but I changed that later on. It was kind of a mess. And eventually, after a whole bunch of decisions about where to put points and how far they should reach, I ended up back at the beginning, where I shift-clicked both points and pressed F to connect them. Now I can create checkpoints, which is really easy. I can just go around to the sort of keyframe points that feel significant and type a checkpoint number, making sure to increase by 1 as I move along. The way I understand it, checkpoints are there to make sure you actually complete the track without skipping anything. So if you make it to the finish line and you only passed 8 of the 10 checkpoints, you won't get a lap. Well, now we just need to make an enemy path real quick. This dictates how the bots will navigate the track, which I don't really need to fully set up just yet, but I will make a technically complete path just to keep it from crashing. Now I've just got to make a folder with everything properly in it and install it as a graphics pack in Cemu, which is the Wii U emulator that I use for Mario Kart 8. If you want to know more about this part of the process, check out part 2 of Squadaloo's tutorial series. I went ahead and named the folder the same thing as Mario Circuits folder. That way it replaces that track. Then I enabled the mod and gave it a go.
Alright, here we go. Will it work? Great, controller's not connected. This is not a good start. Okay, still doesn't work. Maybe Pro Controller? Okay. Okay, I have to rebind all the controls. Dang it. Save. Okay, finally.
And after finally getting my controller working, I gave it a go for real.
Okay, so we need to launch Mario Circuit. Oof, let's see. Alright.
Yeah, that's what I expected. So the first thing I did was go back to the lap paths page of the Track Studio guide and look for possible errors. I cleaned things up where paths might be overlapping and organized the path groups a bit. Crashed. Then I made sure there weren't any duplicate checkpoints for alternate paths and just made the checkpoints at the merging point. I also readjusted some of the return points, which is the specific location and angle that Lakitu places you if you fall off the track at this point. Crashed. So I made sure the enemy path was set up right and organized the path groups even further. Crashed. Then I enabled my DK Pass mod and played that for a second. Didn't crash, because I actually set that one up right. Then I changed the skybox to Mario Circuit. Crashed. Then I created gravity paths. Crashed. So I deleted the gravity paths, and that crashed Track Studio. So I went to my Toad's Factory video to see what went wrong there. And it was of course some unconnected lap paths. So I made sure the lap paths were all connected and even deleted the alternate paths for good measure. At this point, all I could think to do was look at material settings. I had messed with a couple of things at the beginning of the project just to see if they'd make the trees look better, and while looking around at the render state settings on the leaf texture, it was set to minimum color combine instead of add. I don't know what that means, but that's what it was set to that. It was also set to translucent instead of alpha mask, so I switched those settings over, resaved it, and gave it a try.
Oh, it worked.
Hey, what's happening? This isn't a black screen. Where's my desktop?
Whoa. Okay. This is a 0G track.
Turns out those stubborn gravity paths are making things a bit more interesting.
Nope, not 0G anymore. Not 0G again. Nope, not 0G. 0G. That's one way to do it.
But all in all, this is so cool. Whether or not I can drive through the gaps in the railing, or not drive down the alleyways, or not drive on the road, this is still a huge step towards having this track look like what I hoped it would in game. And I plan on getting it there. I'm not just throwing this out to somebody else this time. I actually want to learn the software and make improvements to this. But I'm sure I'll be consulting the Mario Kart 8 modding Discord along the way, so this will still be something of a team effort. Well, anyways, that's gonna do it for this week. I hope you enjoyed. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.